Okay, I'm just setting up here. Just going to make sure that I've got everything I need on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to share the brief again. So remember, word count is 3,500. Infectious diseases, we're looking at producing a booklet for voluntary health workers overseas, so we need to make it applicable to those workers that are working in Africa, Asia, etc. Okay, so it might even well be the South America. So in the first video we covered, and the first PowerPoint, we looked at the range of organisms responsible for infectious disease, and we went on in 1.2 to discuss how these organisms are adapted to cause that disease and act as pathogens. And remember, pathogens are organisms that cause us harm. Okay, so we're now going to move on to looking at vectors, which is 2.1, and how then the body can defend itself. And firstly, we start with what we call the non-specific defenses. In other words, they're not designed to specifically just one particular organisms, but an array. And so the body has these general defenses that we'll talk about. Okay, again, point you to the brief. Okay, make sure that you cover all of the assessment criteria, and the assessment criteria again on the third page. We've got 2.1, explain how different vectors are able to transmit disease in humans. Vectors are ones that carry the disease to us. This in the main will look at insect animal vectors, and then we'll move on to the body's different non-specific defenses against infection. In 3.2, which we'll meet much like slightly later on, we'll have a look at how there are specific defenses when we look at immunity and antibodies, etc. Okay, so back to me, and I will now share with you the PowerPoint. This is on the VLE, although I've just slightly modified the heading to show the fact that it covers 2.1 and 3.1. I'll update the VLE shortly so it reflects that, and then you know where you are. Okay, so remember, it's a 6-credit assignment. So let's make that a little bit bigger. So vectors. This is definition from the World Health Organization, WHO. So it's a trusted site. Put it in inverted commas because it's a direct quote. Okay, so vectors are living organisms that can transmit infectious pathogens between humans or from animals to humans. Okay, so we have human to human and also animal to human. Now, many of those vectors are blood-sucking insects. Now, their purpose is not to transmit the disease. The insect's only after, I'm afraid to say, your blood. It doesn't mean to say the vampires, but they just want your blood. Because remember, the blood is absolutely packed full of nutrients, particularly proteins. And so it's after your blood, and that's why it's biting you. And they're specially designed to do so. Now, what happens is that these blood-sucking insects will, on a feed, ingest, that's taking themselves, the disease producing microorganism during a blood meal from an infected host or from an animal, such as a cattle nearby or sheep or etc. All right. But then they go on to later infect a new host. So it could be the person next to you, another family member, someone down the road. Okay. And it's because they are going from person to person, getting a blood meal. That's how the disease spreads. Okay. Now, the pathogen will replicate and reproduce itself inside you, as well as the vector, the insect. And often once a vector becomes infected, they're capable of transmitting certain diseases for the rest of their life during subsequent bites and meals. So certain ones can lay dormant and then you transfer them. So here are some examples of vector-borne diseases. Now, not so much a problem in this country, although we do have diseases that are transmitted. Most of them are in the sub-Saharan or the tropical areas of the world. Okay, and as we're designing this booklet as an information booklet for overseas students, that's why I've mentioned these particular diseases, but there's lots more that you can look at. I think one of my favorite ones when I was studying is one called Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, really odd name, but transmitted in the Rocky Mountains of America. So, every year, there's more than 700,000 deaths from disease transmitted by vectors, particularly malaria. Now, the malaria parasite is transmitted by insect bites, which we'll see in a moment. So malaria, one of these, some of these are particularly awkward pronunciations and sounding names that you may not have heard of. So schistosomiasis, leishmaniasis, yellow fever, onchocerciasis, dengue, awful diseases, dengue, and what we call the hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola and Lassa fever, all part of the dengue family. Hemorrhagic means it causes extensive bleeding internally. Your internal organs go to mush, and wherever there's a hole, like in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, unfortunately your bottom and the genital area, you could bleed from. It has a 70% death rate, or even higher, some varieties. Then there's human African trypanosomiasis, which is an amoebic disease. Chagas disease in South America. Japanese encephalitis. Encephalitis affects the brain, inflammation of the brain, and as you can see there, in Japan. Now, look at the table from WHO, all right, using this link, and there's a whole array of them. So you can give lots of different examples, not just mine, okay? Don't have to go into detail, but just a nice sample of those, okay? So continuing, as can be seen from the table above, there are a variety of vectors, such as insect vectors of the mosquito family, black fly, sandfly, and in Africa, the tsetse fly. And when the relatives of insects, such as arthropods, can also be involved. Now, fleas, ticks, lice. Over here, we have a condition known as Lyme's disease. That's with a capital L, L-Y-M-E, Lyme's disease. transmitted in ticks, tick bite. If you go walking in the countryside, ticks can be found. They drop off other animals, then they latch onto you. Your dog may well have picked up ticks and they drop off, then feed on you, and can give you Lyme's disease, which can be quite debilitating, fatigue, etc. Okay, lice we will know of. There are body lice, there are head lice, and there are pubic lice, and you can tell the difference by their shape. There's also the triotomy bugs, not found here, but in South America particularly, that causes the Chagas disease. And again, the biting insect transmits the pathogen when it bites. The triotomy bugs look like winged beetles, but they are a type of fly, and also known as kissing bugs. Lastly, mollusks. So things like snails can transmit things like liver fluke. In my day, when I was younger, we were told not to eat wild watercress and things like that, because although you could find it in streams, etc., it might well contain the larvae of the from the snail that's released the liver fluke into the water. So it was never a good thing to kind of like eat wild watercress. Now, again, looking at disease that can turn, most, but not all, are associated with tropical and subtropical regions of the world. So here's an array of these vectors. We have the mosquito. Here we can see the abdomen reddish because it's had a blood meal. Beautifully designed for taking blood from you. Sandflies as well. You can see here the stomach is full of blood, protein rich, so that's why they're trying to bite you. I can remember my mother getting quite barely smitten by sandfly when we were down in, I think it was Dorset area as a young lad. Black flies, that doesn't mean to say the black flies that you see, the blue bottles, but these are specific black flies. The flea, probably best known as things like the actual plague, bubonic plague, although it's kind of like not only biblical and historical, at the same time, when we used to talk about plagues, the bubonic plague, as it was rightly called, or the Black Death, used to occur in medieval periods, and the cause was thought was rats, etc., but it was the fleas on the rats. Get rid of the rats, get rid of the fleas, etc., etc. So yeah, bubonic plague, and you still get small outbreaks of bubonic plague in the world. Here's a tick. This is a tick. It's actually buried its head inside your skin. Nasty, horrible thing. Now, a lot of people think, oh, right, get that out and pull it out. The problem is you leave the mouth parts in, and that's where you can also get infection. So should be removed by a professional. There we have the lice. Now I can tell that these are head lice because they're nice long bodies, because that means your hair. Lice actually prefer clean hair, not horrible kind of like unwashed hair. They like clean hair because it's untangled and they can get to the scalp because they want to get the dried skin. Okay, horrible to think of. The shorter the body, the further down the body you go. So you can imagine, all right, pubic lice are very, very short. That's why It had the awful term crabs, because they were crab-like. They almost have these kind of like pincers to hang on to the pubic hair. Then you have triatoma bugs. Here's the kissing bug on someone's finger here. Beautiful markings on these, but again, biting insect, and can transmit tropical diseases like Chagas disease. And here's the tsetse fly. Again, tsetse flies predominantly in Asia and Africa. Tsetse flies can transmit sleeping sickness, and I believe river blindness. So how do the insects like mosquitoes pass on the pathogen they carry? Well, one of the diseases that they carry that can be carried by what we call the Anopheles species, and there are lots of different mosquito species, is malaria. Now, the female mosquito is the one that bites. The males don't, because the female needs the protein-rich blood so that she can produce lots of eggs, okay, and therefore offspring. So that's why the female is biting you. Okay, now, so they're looking for a blood meal to obtain it so that it can feed. Now, they have specially adapted mouth parts. They're almost syringe-like because they pierce the skin, and cleverly, as it pierces the skin, it releases saliva into the wound. Now, the purpose of the saliva is twofold. It contains a chemical anesthetic, so you don't feel it bite you, all right? So the host is unaware of the bite. It's only when it withdraws that you think, oh, that hurt, all right? And then you swat or might get the mosquito. But the damage may well done, and it's transmitted the actual pathogen. Now, the other chemical acts as an anticoagulant. Now, anticoagulants are chemicals that stop the blood from clotting, because if you're an insect biting through the skin, the body defends itself by sealing that bite, almost like a cut, okay? Got cut my little finger over the holidays, and my body is healed that over by making a clot, so stopping the blood from coming out. Now, for the mosquito or any other biting insect that's after a blood meal, that's disastrous, because if the blood clots, not going to get me blood meal because I can't suck up the blood, the clot. So the anticoagulant is in the saliva. Now, what then happens is that, unfortunately, within the saliva, the mosquito has also got this parasite. Now, it doesn't really harm the mosquito, all right? However, as we transmit the saliva as the mosquito into the host's blood system, there are also these amoeba type parasite, which we met in 1.1 in the first video, called Plasmodium. Now, Plasmodium causes the disease malaria. Now, mosquitoes not bothered if the body meal is from the human or another mammal, such as cattle. So you can have what we call a reservoir of the disease in your cattle, in your herd, in your flock of sheep, whatever, and also wild animals as well. And so there's this ongoing kind of like infection, reinfection, animal to human. Humans get bitten, they go along to the person next to you and get another feed and transmit the disease. So all of that is down to the mosquito getting that blood. Interestingly, if you go on holiday, quite a few of you will notice that if you are female You tend to get bitten first compared to your partner. Not always the case, but generally speaking, it happens. And that's because the surface temperature usually of the woman is just slightly higher, and the insect detects this, thinks, oh, that's an easier blood meal because the blood is close at the surface. But also applies to the male. So if, again, they were hot and came in to the room and the mosquito were about, it would hone in on that heat and think, oh, that's an easy meal because the blood's near the surface, okay? So there are different Plasmodium species, and they cause malaria to different different effects. Some are more severe than others, and also they may occur in Asia or in particular parts of Africa. So the four main species, there are other, are Plasmodium falciparum, all right, which causes most of the deaths due to the malaria in Africa. Okay, now sometimes instead of saying Plasmodium falciparum, we would just put P dot and then falciparum. But because this is an assignment, you'd have to tell me that the P stands for Plasmodium. But if you're writing full sentences, once you've written it once, remember, it's like any abbreviation, you can then use the abbreviation after you've said it. Plasmodium malaria used to be present in southern Europe, particularly Greece and the bottom of Spain, but we virtually eradicated that shortly after the Second World War, so 1940s, 50s. But it still persists in Africa. Plasmodium ovale, it's rare but found in West Africa. Plasmodium vivax, most widely spread parasite transmitted by mosquitoes. However, it's not so severe, and it's more of a chronic condition, meaning long-term, all right, in Asia, all right. Now, over 1 million people each year die from malaria. That's incredible to think, but malaria is a real killer. And between 300 and 500 million are infected at any one time in the world. Remember that it affects the blood, quite debilitating disease. And you may well come across people with malarial symptoms, okay, when you see some people from African nations. Other vectors. There are other vectors in that you've got person to person. So some of these are through sexual activity, okay? So things like gonorrhea, syphilis, all of these, herpes, are through sexual activity. You can have skin to skin, okay? Certain diseases such as leprosy, for example, can be transmitted from human to human. There are different types of leprosy. One isn't transmitted, one is by touch. Human bites, animal bites. There are certain diseases. For example, with animals, you'll see lower down. Mother to child, okay, so while the child is developing, through drug injections, particularly hepatitis, sharing needles. Then you have indirect person to person from contaminated objects, what we call fomites. So anything, so for example, if I was not very good hygienically and I went to the toilet and didn't wash my hands and I put my hand on the mouse and I was moving it about, and then my wife came in and said, oh, I need to use the computer, and she was using this, then I could transmit, all right, fecal material, anything like that. I know it sounds dreadful, all right, but that's why we're very good at trying to wash our hands. One of the things we have to talk about would be, you know, educating people on the need for hygiene. And we're all aware of that now with COVID, about washing our hands thoroughly. But you can pick up diseases from door handles, unclean surfaces. That's why food hygiene standards, you know, cutting boards, work surfaces, that's why we have these laws in this country, okay, about food hygienes. Air droplet spray, people sneezing, a droplet spray. It's pretty disgusting, but you can go on to YouTube and look at a slow-mo sneeze. Person's in profile and they sneeze, and the slow motion actually shows that spray of droplets spreading out very slowly. Now that happens, all right, when people got coughs, colds, etc. And again, that's how we get the droplet kind of like infecting us. We breathe it in, it lands on a nearby object. Normally they don't last very long, few hours on droplet as they dry out, etc. But sneezing and coughing will release droplets. It's amazing to think that the droplets exploding from your mouth and nose, if you sneeze, can reach about 400 miles an hour, the droplet spray, and spread several feet. And as we've seen with COVID, that droplet formation, as breathing it in, can also get us into problems, hence using the masks. So, common vehicle of spread, okay, infected substances, so ingestion of food or water, poor hygiene. So not washing food or contaminated food from especially sewage, water and sewage. One of the greatest kind of like inventions was the sewage system that we had in modern cities, because it separated sewage from drinking water, which could be contaminated. And you used to get outbreaks of cholera and typhoid, amoebic dysentery, all because of contaminated water. And also food washed in contaminated water. That's why when you go abroad, sometimes salads, you have to be very careful about if it's been washed. It looks like clean water. That's why in some areas of the world, we still recommend you drinking bottled water. Fecal contamination is one of the main sources of problems, and blood transmission in cooking, etc. Other ways you can actually get infected is unfortunately through blood transfusions and plasma. We have a very rigorous protocols in Europe, UK, and Northern Hemisphere, but in other parts of the world where they haven't got the money, etc., may well be that blood transfusions and plasma are in short supply because of the cost, etc. But there have been some harrowing cases of people getting HIV from plasma and blood transfusion when that came out with the AIDS of the 80s and 90s. Some people have had hepatitis because of contaminated blood. We do have quite rigorous laws on this now, and screening process. Now, animal-borne ones, what we know are called zoonoses, are usually things like animal bites. Now, one that comes to mind are things like rabies from dog bites, but you can also get bitten from things like bats, other animals, and they can cause infections and transmit pathogens. But rabies is a virus studied by Louis Pasteur, the person that gave us pasteurization, and really the science of microbiology. This is transmitted by dogs. They used to say the dogs were mad. They foam at the mouth, bark and bite. And so we've been lucky in this country, being an island, we've managed to keep it out. Most of Europe now has eradicated rabies, but in certain countries, when you go in, do be careful of what looks like a nice little dog or a nice little cat, because you can get them from cats as well. All right, just be very careful about petting stray dogs and cats, etc. In foreign countries. So moving on, now dealt with vectors. Going on to non-specific defense systems, which is assessment criteria 3.1. Now, the body possesses many mechanisms that impart non-specific defense. Now, the objectives of this are about the mechanisms that prevent microorganisms from gaining a foothold, because your body tries to defend itself. Now, we do have several barriers to stop the actual microbes getting a foothold. And the first most important one are the mechanical barriers. Now, mechanical barriers are at the portal, so things like the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the anus and the genitals. Anywhere where it can enter. And that's where you'll find the first lines of defense. Now, the skin is a very good representative of this, because this skin is continuous, shouldn't have any breaks, okay? Although saying, my cut on my little finger, okay, I immediately washed it, cleaned it. I put a little bit of antiseptic cream off and then covered it. Okay. Now, normally it's nice and waterproof. It's compact. It's continuous. The cells are locked together. Okay. It contains a protein called keratin. Also hardens to form your nails, etc. But the keratin forms a waterproof layer. It's impervious to water and infections. In fact, your skin is covered with millions upon millions of bacteria. But don't worry, you have evolved, and each one of us has its own kind of like flora, different populations of bacteria on our skin, which is a good thing because they've come to a balance with our body and they don't really cause us very much harm because they're on the surface, okay? However, it's when it's broken that there can be a problem. An infection can get in that normally it can't penetrate. And pathogens, if they do land on your skin, are outcompeted by those what we call commensal bacteria and microbes, because they're saying, hey, this is our patch, and they outcompete those pathogens for the nutrients that are there. And they're basically feeding on the dead skin because your skin, the top layer is dead. So, there's no need to kind of like scrub your hands like surgical scrubbing, all right, because they are of benefit. Doesn't mean to say it should be filthy, but it's just saying, use your judgment there. Now, going into these portals, the mouth, the nose, the ears, and the eyes, they are lined with cells which produce mucus. the mucous membranes. So the urinary system, so the exit through the vagina or the penis, the respiratory system of your lungs, and the digestive system or the lining have these mucous membranes. They're moist, but they're also permeable. That means that although they produce fluids such as tears, mucus, and saliva, they rid the membrane of any irritants, dust, microbes. And nasal hairs, all right, they actually trap particles going into the respiratory system, okay? Some of the nasal hairs are quite large, especially in men. Okay, women are slightly more delicate. And then, if you remember, the actual lining of your bronchioles, etc., actually have little tiny hairs called cilia. And the cilia help to sweep any trapped particles, including microbes, out of the respiratory tract, where you either swallow them or you cough them up and get rid of them. So that's more of a physical barrier. Then there are chemical defenses. Now, secretions from lubricating glands, such as the eyes, the reason why the tears are there, and your saliva, not only for digestion, okay, which we dealt with in the aspects of human physiology, but they contained the tears and the saliva a very powerful enzyme called lysozyme. To lyse anything means to break it open, and that's what the enzyme does. It breaks down, all right, the peptidoglycan of cell walls of bacteria. And that starts to break the bacteria. Think of your eyes, they're exposed, it's very soft tissue. So that enzyme actually is really useful in breaking down the walls of the bacteria and destroying them. Now, women in their vaginas also produce lactic acid as a defense mechanism, okay, because otherwise the mucous membranes would be exposed to all kinds of infections. And we do get yeast infections like thrush in men and women, okay, but the lactic acid in the vagina imparts a defense, and extremely useful. Urine is also acidic. That also will destroy quite a few of these microbes entering. Then, of course, in our stomachs, we have very caustic hydrochloric acid that acts as changing the pH for digestion, so protein digestion can start, but also it kills any microbes entering with the food, unless the food is so contaminated that the body is overwhelmed, and that's how we get bouts of diarrhea, etc. If the body just cannot cope with so many bacteria at once. The semen also contain antimicrobial substance called spermine that inhibits bacteria in the male urogenital tract. Okay, highly specialized substance to prevent infections. Genetic barriers. You can get hereditary characteristics of an individual can deter certain diseases. Okay, for example, humans suffer HIV infections because their T lymphocytes have receptor sites for the human immunodeficient virus. They found that the body can learn to produce these, and therefore can actually pass it on. Now, dogs, cats, and other animals are immune to these diseases because they don't possess the genes for producing the receptor sites that we do in humans. So genetically, dogs and cats, although they're mammals, don't suffer from the same HIV virus. Conversely, humans don't suffer from canine distemper, all right, which is a skin disease, because again, genetically, we do not have those receptor sites for the virus to cause the disease. So the genetic differences between animals as well. So that's why we don't get certain diseases that animals do, and some animals don't get diseases that we get because of genetic disorders. Genetic differences. Inflammation, usually people think of inflammation as a bad thing, but it's a non-specific response to any trauma is inflammation. And some inflammation is good because you need it for the healing process, all right? But obviously too much can be painful and does cause heat and swelling and redness and pain. But some of it is useful because inflammation mobilizes components of the immune system and sets into motion repair mechanisms. I know, for example, if you have a break, you get inflammation around that break. Well, actually, they want that part because it encourages phagocytes to come to the area and destroy any microorganisms that might have entered, particularly if you have a very complex break that you may well see as a health care professional or someone abroad where the bones actually come out. It did happen to me with my leg. The actual tibia did come out from my skin as it splintered. But then the body retracts it slightly before I could get in. Well, that could bring in, as it slightly slipped back, into the skin, and the skin tries to then heal around it and clot, etc. That could drag in infection. So that's one of the reasons why inflammation is there, to kind of like combat the actual infection. Now, inflammation can be controlled by the nervous stimulation and chemical substances called cytokines. Okay, and we'll come across cytokines later when we talk about T lymphocytes that produce special cytokines. Now, these chemicals, chemical products of tissue cells and blood cells are responsible for many of the actions of inflammation. And the loss of fluid leads to local swelling called edema. Okay. And in types of inflammation, phagocytes accumulate in a whitish mass of cells and bacteria, which is why we get spots and pus around that infected area, because it's the white blood cells, the phagocytes, destroying the microbes that have entered. Okay. Fever is another defense mechanism, because if we raise the temperature, it happens in a number of traumas, it initiates the circulation of substances called pyrogens. Pyro is usually associated with pyrology, is to do with heat. So pyrogens, which affects the brain's hypothalamus. Again, we've come across the hypothalamus in the brain when looking at hormones. And in this case, it causes it to raise the temperature. Although excessive fever is dangerous, a fever is believed to have a beneficial role because it retards the growth of temperature-sensitive microorganisms, such as leprosy bacilli. Leprosy can cause rotting of the the flesh, but also deforms limbs, etc., especially in bones that you would see in some leprosy patients. Causes metabolism of the body cells while stimulating the immune system. So a little bit of fever is fine, but not too much, because we don't want it to raise too much, but then it would cause us harm. Okay, we just need to keep it under control. Now, to summarize, all right, this is a diagram freely available on the internet. You can see there, easynotes.com. If you wish to use it, you can do. Remember, it is a summary, and all summaries must be explained. You can't use bullet points because it is a booklet, but it is a good summary. So you can always say the following table summarizes, okay, this, and put a table in. And again, if you want to increase your word count, then leave it in as a table, okay. If you want to decrease it, then a picture or a photograph. That way it decreases your word count. Entirely up to you. Okay, so let's just quickly go through again about these non-specific defenses. The skin is nearly impermeable, okay, unless it's cut, it's waterproof, it's resistant to lots and lots of toxins and enzymes of the invading organisms. We also have mucous membranes that act as physical barriers, lining the respiratory and digestive tracts, and sticky mucus in both of these, the respiratory and the digestive tract, not forgetting also the reproductive system as well. Now, chemical barriers, sweat, oil from the skin, produce chemicals that slow or prevent the growth of bacteria. The lining of the stomach produces hydrochloric acid, and the vagina also lactic acid. Urine slows bacterial growth because of the acidity. Sometimes, though, yeast infections a little bit more difficult to combat. Even they will tolerate acidity, the acid of urine. It also flushes out the urethra with the urine. Saliva and tears contain lysozyme, that enzyme that literally lyses, breaks open the bacteria, the microbes, therefore they can't multiply. Then there is, instead of a list, there's a diagram on the right-hand side that shows these tears, the skin, the large intestine, etc., that again allows for this non-specific. It's not targeting a particular microbe or pathogen. It's anything that's entered your body that the body goes, oh, that's not part of me, I need to attack it. So that's what we mean by non-specific. It's not particularly designed for any one pathogen. It's for all pathogens. If, however, there is a problem, that's when we move into what we call the specific defenses, which we'll meet later. And that's the PowerPoint for this session. So that's me over and done with for the second video. Remember, I will be talking to you in class about it, and you can see me anytime in class or email me. But please, please, please make a start. PowerPoints are on the VLE, other resources are there. And again, you must research, it must be your own work. You cannot use this, all right, materials or PowerPoints. Don't mind you using some of the diagrams, etc. All right, but as you can see, there's lots on the internet that you can access. Okay, well, as you can see, it's getting nighttime, so I shall say good night, and I will see you all soon.